Elevator Systems, Bowen Family Systems Theory in brief for a life of learning. Welcome to Elevator Systems, the podcast that looks at Bowen Family Systems Theory ideas in brief and understandable ways. This season we're looking at mild, medium, and hot topics. And if you can't tell, today we are looking at a topic that divides as much as it brings people together, where we wear our allegiance on our back and on our head, and where we regularly gather with friends and family to yell and cheer for different sides. Today we are talking about sports, and Amie Post is back again to tackle this, I think, fun and interesting topic. Welcome back, Amie.
Thank you, Dixie. Thanks, Katie. I'm so excited to be here with you today. And I've been thinking a lot about sports for a long time. I have been involved in team sports since I was about 4.5 years old. I remember running backwards on a basketball court and falling down and deciding I would never play again. My parents had some other ideas. What I'm thinking about is if you have ever watched or played sports at any level, you already know what an emotional system looks like. And I think Bowen theory gives us a way to actually understand what we're watching, how anxiety organizes the whole team's functioning, how automatic patterns emerge under pressure, and most importantly, how there's a real path to growing maturity and becoming a more consequential member of our team, especially the most important team ever, our family.
Ooh, I don't know. That's a hard one to follow. I also am pretty excited about this topic. I also have been both playing and watching sports most of my life. And so my elevator pitch is about, I think sports demonstrates the forces of togetherness and individuality that we watch, that we see in Bowen theory. You can see many of the ways, we see in sports, like Amie said, in human relations, problem solving, anticipating or sensitivity to another's moves, understanding patterns and strategies, thinking about reciprocity, competition, reactivity, and polarization, just to name a few. I really appreciate that in sports, you can watch those forces of togetherness and individuality in action. I think being on a team or being connected, I'm kind of repeating what Amie said, can teach us so much about our functioning with others. I think that we learn how to get clearer. It's a place we could learn to get clearer in our own position in systems as well. But mainly, this is maybe less theoretical, I love how sports can both bring us together to hope for success and share despair. So I think it's also a model for the benefits of a group. So that's my pitch. Dixie, what have you got?
Mine is like a little unusual because I did want to highlight, as I was prepping for this, there is a lot of like sportsy language in Dr. Bowen's writing. So you have that term coach for a counselor or therapist. You have that stadium view he refers to quite a few times about the usefulness of a broad, big picture perspective. And then I was thinking about that phrase, there's no I in team. Do you know that?
Yeah.
Do you know that old phrase? And I was thinking about how differentiation of self informs that statement, the balance between the individual and the collective, the reciprocal influence of the team on the individual players and the players on the team. And then I was thinking, not all I's are the same. And so I would wonder how a team of more differentiated players might play differently, and if the level of differentiation might impact one's physical capabilities. I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on that. I have two other pitches. One is I'm going to just send people to the show notes because I have a letter from Dr. Bowen from the Murray Bowen Archives Project where he refers to how a family member can be a strong player. I'm not going to read it, but I'm going to send people to there, a letter from 1973. And I took a quote from a family therapy and clinical practice where he really explores the idea of what it means to function in our families. And Dr. Bowen says, we could describe a quarterback in terms of his physical and psychological makeup, or we could describe his individual adaptation to the requirements of the quarterback position, or we could describe his function with the team in an entire season of play. The latter would be similar to the viewpoint from which we have tried to observe family members as they function together as a family unit. A football coach knows his players as individuals, but when he watches the team in action, he focuses first on the team as a functioning unit and then on the functioning of the individual team players. And then lastly, I have a quote from Kathleen Smith's Anxious Overachiever newsletter. And she says, relationships rarely calm down when we put them under a microscope. Too much of an anxious focus can keep us stuck. Dr. Bowen called this the close-up view and compared it to a football game. When you're on the field, you don't have the advantage of someone watching from the top of the stadium. You only see from your corner. You miss the patterns. Zooming out requires you to begin to think about the emotional playing field of your own family. Okay, we dove in here. What do you all notice?
I got curious when I was researching this, thinking about what is the purpose of sports? Like, what is it adapted for? But I was thinking about what is so useful about the metaphors when you were giving those examples from Dr. Bowen. Like, what is it about thinking of a team? I mean, I can name a billion couples that come into my office and talk about, we just want to be on the same team, right? Like thinking about, there's something about the understanding of a team in way, thinking about how we function that's useful to people. It sounds like Dr. Bowen took that and thought about it as a metaphor that people could think through.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that like foundational to Bowen's theory is the idea that anxiety is living in every single living being and influencing the mutual relationships, right? And that the things that anxiety is just designed to sense and react to real or perceived threat. And that sensing and reacting to threat then sets up really automatic instinctual patterns that are effective in navigating that threat, but then they get maintained out of efficiency. Yeah. So one of the examples I was bringing is that when I was a little kid, I played little kid basketball with the all-time great coach, Jim Hatch. Jim really focused on fundamentals, but he also focused on noticing when anxiety or the pressure of the game was interrupting our ability to engage the fundamentals. So we were playing lights out in a season where there was a really consistent pattern. The ball would get inbounded to me. I would quickly pass it to Melissa T. Melissa T would take 3 strong dribbles toward the wing and then pass it down to Melissa C, who would turn and shoot. And we were dominating the whole season in that game until we ran into the really incredibly fast St. Agnes team. And they learned our pattern very quickly and interrupted it. We had no flexibility in the system because we were so efficient and so consistently successful in navigating challenge with our preferred pattern. And we were really stymied for a minute. Coach Hatch called timeout. He said, hey, folks, let's just remind ourselves of what options we have available. His really wise daughter, Colleen, goes, yeah, right? Every time we get the ball, we can pass, we can dribble, or shoot. And coach goes, yeah, that's right. But first you have to slow down and think about those options. We come out of timeout, ball gets inbounded to me. I managed to hold on to the very idea of slow down and think. And instead of just passing it to Melissa T, I took a strong dribble right to the basket and hit a layup. It worked.
Yeah.
It brought flexibility there, but I couldn't have changed my pattern without the opportunity to see how things were going a little bit differently and the invitation to slow the heck down. And I think that's where differentiation of self meets anxiety.
Yeah, I appreciate that example. I was just thinking about a family doing the exact same work, slowing it down, looking at the moves. Like I think that was so useful. And I think you hit on some things that sports helps me think about in family too, which is flexibility, right? I think Dixie's question about if we had a whole team of differentiated players, would that be a better functioning team? And I don't know, maybe that might have less flexibility. I don't know. It's a curious question about what that looks like. I always get interested in players who don't specialize and what flexibility that offers them. I was listening to, it's baseball season and you started, and my husband loves baseball. And I was listening to this announcer speak about the advantage that some player had because they didn't just play baseball since they were, an infant. They played baseball, and then they played soccer, and then they played. So they were able to kind of draw on, build even their physiology differently, learn different ways of being, different ways of thinking. And I think that flexibility is a resource. Well, at least that announcer thought so, in the way this person was functioning on the team.
I was going to say my sports interests are pretty limited to some key Canadian teams. And so last year when the Blue Jays were in the World Series, there was the one player from LA who was a pitcher and a hitter. And they had to, I forget his name, unfortunately, but they had to rework the rules because he could do all of those things. And yeah, what does that add up to? How do those different skills cause a system to rethink or adapt? Go ahead, Amie.
Well, I was thinking, Dixie, what you bring forward for me is that there is variation in how a system and an emotional unit can react and respond to anxiety. And I think Bowen theory gives us such a cool tool to be able to observe the influence of anxiety, but also notice the impact of how others, this relationship process, can influence who and how we're doing it. In that example of the baseball player who can both be a really good defensive player and contribute offensively, that level of flexibility isn't just about that player. It impacts the whole team. Yeah. And I think that's one of the cool points about Bowen theory is that if any one person begins to kind of take on a responsibility to shift their functioning, it will necessarily influence the functioning of others.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The example that I'm going to take this potentially on a detour. So if people don't want to go there, stop me. But I was thinking about, I did a little deep dive in evolution and thinking about sports because there's such a large, it's so interesting to me how for many, not everyone, but for many people, sports are a large part of human families. I was sitting last night with two friends, catching up about how their lives are dominated by sports on the weekend, right? The two of their kids play hockey, one plays baseball, and thinking about how this is, there has been something about the human since ancient times that we've thought that this is a useful thing to keep moving forward. We can talk about all the ways that, I didn't want to go into all the ways that it's useful for our physiology. But the other thing I was interested in thinking specifically about Bowen theory, about the advantage of testing out functioning in different spaces. And I just wondered about, work is always a space, but pre-work, you have school, you have these, I wondered if the usefulness of sports, both playing and watching, is sort of another way that we have really highlighted the importance of, we're a social species, we learn and develop in groups and units, and how sports could be just a way that has stuck with us that really does provide that function for our species. So I don't know if that made any sense, but that was where I was just really interested. I went to Mexico and saw this ancient Mayan ruins of a sporting court, right? It was a court, that this has been something that has been an interest for our species for so long. And therefore, I think, how it serves a function and importance for us. I think I learned so much, as well as I connect to family members now through sports. Checking about how my nephew's doing in his baseball team, connecting, I'm wearing my Bears jersey. So my contact with my extended family increases during football season because we check in with one another and then we ask other questions, right? We lament over, sometimes cheer, but often lament over the Bears season and then have more contact around that. So I just got interested at how this has kept being a real important function for humans.
Yeah, I appreciate what you're saying. And I was thinking about how parents' interest in children's sports participation can also become almost the orienting mechanism for a parent's adult existence. I'm sporting my son's football jersey from the Boys Latin School in Baltimore, Maryland, and my youngest kids field hockey apparel from Oberlin College. Why do I still have these items in my home? Because their participation in those venues contributed to a way I understood, knew, and experienced myself. The degree to which it is the dominant force in how I define self is an interesting question. And could I be aware of that and then invite some flexibility? That might be the practice arena that I would take on. I don't know, Dixie, do you see that how sports both organize and orient individuals, families, and groups as something that Bowen theory can support, or does Bowen theory discount it?
Well, I mean, is that a content versus process? Like, it happens under all circumstances, I would say. Where my brain is going, my example, Katie always says, don't give self-deprecating examples, Dixie, but I'm just going to do it because this is a pretty core memory for me here. But I think it speaks to what you're both talking about anxiety. In grade 9, my homeroom teacher was the basketball coach, and I had played volleyball before, but never basketball. And when I tried out for the team, the teacher knew that I was very smart, and I did make the team, and he made me a point guard for one game. And then he realized that my smarts in the classroom did not extend the same way in the court. And I was thinking about what's the difference, because a point guard really is that, they sort of call it like the quarterback, right? They're starting the plays, they're moving things forward, and people would come towards me and I would just lose my thinking so easily. And I was thinking volleyball is different. You're on one side, they're on the other. You know, you're playing against each other, but it's not in your face. And so, I don't know, I guess I've been thinking about how that does speak a little bit about my level of differentiation, and when the engagement from others comes, I can sort of lose my thinking pretty quickly. And I do wonder if I had pushed myself more in some of those some sports endeavors, maybe what I would have grown in that, versus definitely not trying out for a basketball team again.
Yeah. I mean, I thought with your question is, would I function the same? Could I get really interested in how my functioning works across various contexts? You know, I don't play a sport right now, but would it be so interesting to watch if my functioning on the team was similar to my functioning in my marriage? You know, how that works. But I don't know. When you first asked the question, I was also thinking about people who their team loses a game and it really collapses their functioning, or the parent. You know, my sister told me a story of a parent who was sitting on the sidelines of her son's baseball team, swearing at the children on the other team. Her child is in grade 4, you know, and is swearing at these other. He was so invested in the game that almost, I just think it took away potentially from this man. I don't know this man. I'm just, you know, from his better thinking. And how is that useful to kind of help, if he's interested, help him think about his intensity there, with his functioning of his child, that intensity of that fusion.
You know, it is, as you're saying that, I'm thinking about how does Bowen theory help us think about how we revert to those automatic patterns under pressure, you know, and who's, it wasn't necessarily the dad's pressure, but it was the dad's experience of the kid's pressure that activates a response in relationship to other.
Yeah.
I think, you know, in our house, we talk a lot about Tom Brady. My husband, Chris, is grew up outside of Boston and was a longtime fan of the New England Patriots, kind of a steady, loyal fan with many disappointments. And when the Brady era started and they started to be successful, it became a real hero's journey in our home. So I've learned a lot about Tom Brady over the years. And I think one of the reasons Tom Brady is considered a GOAT is that his greatness rested on this assiduous commitment to study self, to know the patterns of other, and then to constantly test, learn, integrate, and grow. I think some of what we're talking about here is that sports are attractive to us as a people because we have a way of thinking about what's it take to get a little bit better. And in Bowen theory, what is it that we're studying? We're studying our own patterns, our own automatic patterns that emerge when we're under pressure. We begin to respect and appreciate the pressures we feel when other people are going through their own automatic patterns. And over time, we begin to take on these opportunities to move toward the tension, just like going to the weight room and doing a really good workout. And we have ways of thinking about reviewing our tapes, like a Monday morning quarterback session, by looking at a coach at our family over time. There are ways that we can grow ourselves up and become a more mature team player on this family team. Tom Brady, brilliant, right? Like we know for a fact that he studied tapes like over and over again. But Tom Brady was also the first in the weight room and the last off the sprint field. And he wasn't operating independently either. He really knew the strengths of all his team.
Yeah, I think that was the part I was going to punch up from that is like, I think your example gives such a thing about individual responsibility and work on self. And I'm always going to punch up the, the benefit and the resourcefulness of the group, even thinking about the fans, right? Seattle will speak about the Seattle Seahawks. God, I went blank for a second there. Will speak about the 12th man, right? Their stadium, the energy that is supplied from the fans in their stadium is a resource to the team. But I think that can work many different ways, right? Talking about, I can think of an example of someone in my life who really wants their child to play. I'm living in Canada. They really want their child to play hockey, and their child is just not interested and potentially just that's not where they have the skill. And yet that's still that level of intensity is coming from that parent. So in a way that intensity functions very differently. But I think what I'm trying to say here is that I respect that Bowen theory gives me the both and piece of this, thinking about the individual as well as the system in which that they're embedded in.
One thought I had is professional athletes, it was recently the Olympics and you have these hockey players that are on one team during the NHL season, and then the Olympics come and suddenly their allegiance changes because of their country of origin. And I was just thinking what that maybe experience is like for the team members, or thinking about these classic rivalries between teams, or for example, I'm wearing an Edmonton Oilers gear, but I don't live in Alberta. But I'll always cheer for the Oilers. And so even though I move to a province where there is another, there's the Jets playing in my province, I'm going to cheer for the Oilers. And so how people decide on their alliances and when they, what is the criterion when that differs from the group that they're in. Bit of an aside, but interesting.
That stimulates for me. I was thinking, despite my husband Chris's deep desire and much to his chagrin, Tom Brady never called Chris and said, "What feedback do you have from me?" Right? So there's something about differentiation of self, I think, that also invites us to weigh carefully whose observations, feedback, and energy gets to influence or direct us. And it's a little harder to do if you get swept up in the moment of a group emotional process than if you've been thinking about it ahead of time, about who gets what weight in a conversation. Dixie, how did you decide to stay connected to Edmondson even though you live in a different province?
Well, number one would be my husband, I guess. And probably that deep, deep childhood, Wayne Gretzky. That was all the thing when I was growing up. And in fact, we were just talking the other day about remember when he left, we all blamed his wife for that and just thinking what else was going on there. But I think it's just a very deep part of my childhood.
I was thinking the part I didn't tell in the story of the 5th grade basketball Amie was that as I'm sitting there holding the ball and trying to listen to Coach Hatch's instructions, my dad was up in the stands yelling, pass it, it. And I felt pressure from both sides. What I was able to draw on in that moment was I was pretty darn good at that quick little dribble to a layup move. And I remembered that strength in myself. I held on to that. I don't know how. I mean, this is 5th grade, so who knows?
Great question.
But I was thinking too, it's like, I know better now that when my almost 5-year-old grandson says, I am a terrible grandmother because I did not buy him a toy, but instead I brought a book as the surprise, then I'm not going to let his opinion of me change how I think about myself. He has a certain level of feedback, but I am going to privilege my basic sense of who I am a little bit more intentionally than the influence of the other at this stage in the game.
It'd be so interesting to think about athletes through time, that how they think about where they draw their sense of self. In the news recently, there is a very famous athlete who's struggling, who got into another bit of trouble and has had a lot of pressure on him. I'm speaking of Tiger Woods with his next DUI that just happened. And how would one think about where you ground your sense of who I am and how I define that? I'm going to chew on that. I think that's a useful question to think about. And how the people around them, their parents, their coaches, the world impact that.
And what's conscious and unconscious, because I remember Victoria Harrison once, and I'll see if it's been maybe written up in the Family Systems Forum, but she had done some research about university sports players whose playing ability began to decrease as their parents were going through divorce. And just noticing that difference. And so, I mean, we are impacted by the stressors of our system, and what's conscious and what's unconscious. I'll see if I can find something written on that.
I think you're pulling up a really important point here, which is, as I think about it, this is not just about conscious and unconscious. I think this is more about the anxiety and its influence on our functioning and relationship systems is happening at that physiological level. So it's even like deeper than conscious or unconscious. We're talking about instinctually, mutually, physiologically influencing constantly. Right? It's and to become more objectively aware of that mutual influence all of the time gives us then some potential pathways for how to navigate it a tiny bit differently. I think that's a little different than the individual psychology perspective that would look at it as subconscious, conscious. This is more at a unit level. I mean, just imagine if your kneecap suddenly became aware of the fact that it was connected to the tendons holding it in place. And yet our families are really organized as if we're kneecap and tendon in relationship to each other. There's no existence outside of the mutuality. Kitty, you said something about the role of a coach, and I was just sitting here wondering, one of my questions is, what do you think makes a good coach in terms of Bowen's theory?
Ooh, good question. Okay, I'm going to do my best on the spot thinking. I think a good coach has a playbook to draw from. So I would think of that as theory. Like I have a way of thinking about human functioning, family system functioning. And I have a discipline. I think a good coach has a discipline about taking that stadium view. I think that is, or even maybe the ability to move in and out of that stadium view. You know, I watch Australian rules football, and they have a practice with coaches where they both are on the field and they sit in the box above the field, and I get interested in, you know, that process of is a good coach someone who really can watch that ability to get into the process that's occurring right now, as well as, you know, the discipline to step back and say, what does this mean for the overall system? I think when I'm functioning as a good coach, I'm not telling people what to do, which maybe happens on a good day. But I think that part is, you know, just like your coach, I thought that was a lovely example where what are the other plays you have here? I mean, I think that to me would represent good coaching, as well as to pull up and remind someone of the strategies that they have to manage themselves, right? You know, I think I know enough physiologically about my own work that when I'm so anxious that I can't access my thinking, I mean, that's why I think togetherness is part of this theory, that there is a person who could come in and be a resource to me in that. So that's the best I'd be interested in what you guys thought about that. I like that question. A good coach.
What do you think, Dixie?
Well, the thing that comes to mind for me is, I think different than other counseling modalities, every Bowen theory counselor, therapist, coach has their own coach. They are aware that they are human and have these like in the field challenges. And you are able to use this stadium view, this theoretical orientation. But I think that appreciation of your own work is different versus
One
expert,
of my
maybe.
favorite examples of good coaching is Ted Lasso. And I think about Ted Lasso's kind of, you know, he was not actually an expert in the sport he was coaching. But what I think he was expert in is understanding how emotional systems operate over time. And he also was appreciative of the work of a team is to meet each individual where they are and invite them to grow, while helping their individual growth connect to the overall team's functioning as consistently as possible. I think there's a beautiful parallel process that Ted goes through, both in his ability to coach and respond to the challenge of this team that he was inheriting, with his own work with himself and in his family. And I think for me, the key, like you were saying, Dixie, is that the anybody who's operating from Bowen theory isn't just applying the theory at others. They are working to live the theory in self. And they're relating consistently over the course of many decades to other coaches who are trying to think about and work on their own maturity in relationship to others. I think that is what, right? If anxiety is transmitted at that physiological, instinctual level, so too, I think differentiation of self is.
Yeah.
And you'd smell it, I would imagine, in the same way folks smelled it in Ted, like he was the real deal.
Yeah.
You know, he was the real deal, and different than Nate, who was a faker pants. Nate's Ted's assistant, who was just so much more focused on manipulating other to serve his own needs, whereas Ted was process all the way, win or lose, he was there to learn.
Yeah. And what does it take? I mean, I think with Ted Lasso, I think even thinking through, what does it take to be a leader and owner of that team, to let that process play out? The context of that show is the hope that he was going to fail. But then the ability to see how that one-to-one, I mean, I think, you know, that one-to-one relationship that he worked on with that owner allowed things to shift in that system and her perspective. I don't know where I was going with that, but I was thinking about the challenge a family is up against in a coach who wants to go about things differently. I guess that's what I was thinking about.
For sure. Imagine if Ted had coached Jamie Tart from day one with an antagonistic or aggressive view in trying to change Jamie.
Yeah.
Instead, he just created over and over again opportunities for Jamie to begin to see the part he was playing in the team's functioning, and then invitations for Jamie to modify his part to, at the end of season 3, Jamie goes, oh, wait a minute. I don't have to be the dude who scores all the plays. I can be the decoy and pretend to be that person, but it's actually going to be more effective if the ball gets not to me, his famous line, not to me, but through me. Yeah. That's real leadership.
And I was thinking about when you told that story again, I had like a physiological response in me. Like I had that, oh, I remember that. I haven't watched that in a little while. And I think it's the same thing, you know, as a coach, when you sit, I'm going to monitor this now, to think about the physiological response in me, you know, watching a family kind of begin to take on the work and do things differently. And yeah, I think that it's a question I'm going to leave with.
Any other takeaways, questions, resources that you guys have for our listeners?
I was just going to say, think about the team you're on right now, your family, maybe your workplace, your closest relationships. Can you just start to notice your automatic patterns, not just the unhelpful ones, but even the most helpful ones? And where are you doing reliably the same thing, regardless of what is actually happening on the court? And what would it take not to change the pattern, but just to see it more clearly enough that you might have a choice? And I think that's the beginning of this work. Observe self, maybe begin to regulate self. That idea I borrowed in 5th grade, slow down, and then relate to others from that tiny bit more grounded place. I think it's less of a technique and more like a lifelong practice, which to me is exactly what this analogy to sports holds.
Yeah. I had some of that, and then the other part, I'm going to do what I just said I shouldn't do, which is encourage people and tell them what to do. Which is, I think that sports, one of my greatest gifts to connecting with people around sports is it gives me a context to get to know them better. And so it's a challenge that I will send out is the next time that you are watching sports together, how do you turn to the person next to you and just ask them a question about themselves or share something more about yourself? I just think, I think these are opportunities we have to just get in better connection with people around us in a really lighter way. You know, if you're sitting watching the baseball game, ask how things are going to work, you know, I think, or how things are in the family. So it's just I just want to encourage people to take up the opportunity that they have through connecting over sports. Dixie.
Mine was, I love the stadium view. I'm a history major, so I'm always going to love the stadium view. There is something really helpful when we look at the past from that broader perspective, see all the different aspects and influences and how they turn out across time. I think that's so helpful. And it really is different than kind of being in the middle of being in the soup with what's in front of you. And you don't see all the factors. You don't know how it's going to turn out. But humans do have this capacity. We got to live in the present. And how do we think about that stadium view, past, present, and future? And how do we grow both of those capacities? You know, unlike what I did in grade 9, didn't really work on my dealing with that other team. So that's what I was thinking of, the stadium view and that on the field, and growing both of those. So good. Well, thanks for being here, Amie.
Well, thanks for having me. And I just, thanks to my mom and my dad and all the good coaches I've had across my lifetime, it has made a difference for me.
Yeah, me too. Good and bad ones. I will say.
That's right.
Yes.
And I'm just going to remind everyone that if you would like to support this podcast efforts, the behind the scenes efforts, there is a link for our Ko-fi site where you can share a little bit of resources with us so we can keep this going. If you would like to learn more about Bowen theory, there are lots of resources to check out. Please check out the Living Systems website. Amie, I'm going to also lead you in her direction to the Center for Family Systems Theory of Western New York, or the Bowen Center for the Study of the Family. Dixie today mentioned Kathleen Smith's Substack, as well as Family Systems Forum, where you can read more about Bowen theory. And then also, if you're interested, by the time this podcast comes out, a few days later, Amie and I will be presenting in Chicago. So please come out and see us in person or online at the Center for Family Consultations Midwest Symposium on May 1st and 2nd. So there are lots of opportunities for you if you got curious from thinking about sports and Bowen theory to take that action to learn more about Bowen theory.
Excellent. Well, I hope today sparks lots of thinking, no matter what team you cheer for, and as you go out into your relationships. This podcast is produced by Living Systems, a nonprofit organization in Vancouver offering counseling and training programs in Bowen family systems theory across Canada.